you get to see that everything is connected, and you get to see like that food is really just, it's the earth and it's the sun and those energies working together. And if you can kind of guide them in the right direction, you actually just get this beautiful, abundant, nourishing, it's quite miraculous, day-to-day miracles, I suppose. That's what I love about growing vegetables.
Hello, everybody. It is Dani Valent here for an episode of Dirty Linen, my food and hospitality podcast. And today, joyfully, a bit of a gardening podcast as well. My guest today is Alice Crowe, who has written A Heide Harvest, a really sumptuous, beautiful, celebratory book that springs from the Heide Garden in suburban Melbourne. I'm really thrilled as a beginning, hopeless gardener to chat to Alice. I'm going to sneak in a few gardening tips for myself along the way. But Alice, welcome to Dirty Linen.
Thanks, Dani. Thanks so much for having me. We'll definitely get you out into the garden by the end of this episode.
Well, I've even been in the garden today already, and I don't know if it's because I knew I was talking to you and I wanted to feel like ever so slightly smug, but I have even extracted some worm juice and tipped it onto my tiny patch of soil today. So does that give me a little righteousness to start this conversation?
Yeah, I love it. There's always an element of smug that comes with being in the garden, isn't there? But it's also, I just find it so grounding and beautiful. It's a beautiful way to start the day, no matter what you're doing.
What's your garden like at home?
It's wild, completely wild, and I grow a bit of everything. I put in the things that I love, so there's no particular design or order to it. It's got flowers everywhere, it's got fruit trees, it's got veggies, I've gardened the nature strip, I've put a share garden out on the nature strip with tomatoes and flowers, and I'm a bit obsessive, as you can hear.
Oh, I love that. I think the idea of the garden on the nature strip is so wonderful. And whenever I see that someone's tending the nature strip, I not only appreciate it for what you can see, but I also appreciate it because it shows that that person is choosing to spend their time in a certain way, that they're not entirely caught up with appointments and running hither and thither, that they are devoting time to this public act of goodness. And I find that very impressive in itself.
Yeah, it's there's a couple of elements to it. It's not only are you taking what you can do and sharing it with the world, you're actually inviting people to come and talk to you about it, and there's no there's no pressure on them. People can just be walking past and they can stop and have a chat if they feel like it, or if they don't want to, they keep walking. But I've got to know so many of my neighbours in a way that I would not have otherwise, because they wanted to stop and tell me about like the variety of beans that their grandma grew, or, we end up sharing seeds and then we become friends. And then, it's just from the very small act of being out the front of your house in a public place and doing something which people can have an interest in. So yeah, there's a lot of connection in a lot of ways. And also I see, because I grow herbs and tomatoes and flowers and lots of things out there, and I've got a little sign that says, it's a share garden, please take what you need, leave some for your neighbours. And, every now and again I'll look out the front window and I'll see someone with some scissors grabbing some chives, or it's actually it gives me a really beautiful feeling that I'm contributing something out to my neighbourhood.
So I love, Alice, that right at the start of this conversation, we've sort of got distracted, just like some bolting herbs or something, but we've also touched on the idea of gardening as connection. So let's get to the nub of this book, which is at Heide. So for people who don't know about Heide, can you just give us the little intro?
Yeah, sure. Heide is a really beautiful place. Everyone should know it. It's in suburban Melbourne. It's the full name is Heide Museum of Modern Art, and it's an art gallery and museum. It's set in 16 acres of heritage gardens on the Yarra River in the Melbourne suburb of Bulleen. The founders were John and Sunday Reid, who were a couple who purchased the property in the 1930s. And they began, they were both from like establishment families. Like Sunday had grown up in Toorak and John in a mansion in Tasmania. But they had a shared vision, and so what's very well known about them is that they supported They were great patrons of the arts, and they supported the development of like a uniquely Australian style of modernism. And they were very active in cultural life. They used their means and their privilege as a way to support the artists that they admired. And so many people will know that Sydney Nolan and Joy Hester and Albert Tucker and many other artists were regular visits there. Some of them lived there with John and Sunday. And they were, they were very devoted to that life and that public element of their life. But I suppose also many of your listeners will probably know there were some great love affairs that went on there, some menage a trois, and that's like quite well known about Heide and the history and the mythology. But what's less well known, I suppose, is the fact that John and Sunday were both like really just devoted naturalists, devoted lovers of the earth at heart, and they centred their life around that. So they had these 16 acres that were basically bare dairy farms. It had been all the vegetation had been cut back. Like there was literally nothing there. And they made it into this haven, this paradise. They just planted and gardened, and they were almost obsessive about it. But that aspect of them is less well known, but it was just central to everything that they did. And for me to work in those gardens and then to, be able to write about it and share that joy with people, it was quite a privilege.
Well, it really comes through, and you're right. Like I didn't know. I mean, I've been to Heide a lot and have loved walking through the gardens and appreciating the cottage gardens and being inspired by that. But what I learned from your book is that people that came and stayed with them, these artists and thinkers, were also required to work in the gardens or milk the cows or, get their hands in the soil. And I thought that was that was really interesting, that there was this sense of doing in the being, I guess, and that the creative project was more than just the traditional notion you might have of being an artist.
Yeah, it makes me laugh, like the great artists of the time being used effectively as forced labour in the garden and, doing the weeding, like literally getting their hands dirty and contributing in a very kind of fundamental way to the life that went on at Heide. Like it was all communal, it was very communal. They lived in the old farmhouse, which is still on the property, and the library is still intact, and all the books that the Reeds had are preserved. So that was like a centre of activity. But the garden during the day, everyone was required, no matter what their skill level, to contribute in some way to being part of the garden. So, growing the food that they ate that Sunday then prepared for them. And like it was just that sense of being bound to the life of the earth, just where they were.
Yeah, I think it's so instructive. I think, if we think about present day, so many of us are very disconnected from where our food comes from. And even to talk about, gardening and growing on a food podcast seems slightly tangential, which is crazy because where does the food come from? It has to be grown. Exactly. It's absolutely foundational. So Alice, you touched on the fact that you worked at the gardens at Heide. Tell us how the book came about.
Yeah, so I was the kitchen gardener at Heide, and we've talked a little bit about joy already in this podcast, but that of all the jobs I've had in my life, that was the one where it just brought the most joy to people. Like people would walk into the kitchen garden and you could just see their face change, their whole demeanour. They became connected to their surroundings. They became curious. There was a lightness. And I suppose we don't talk often enough about delight in life these days, but you'd see there's a sense of delight. People were really open. They wanted to talk to you, just like the nature strip garden in a way. And so I'd always kind of had in my mind, it would be great to just share this, like if only more people could participate in this and have this in their own lives. And I wanted to share, just that feeling of being in the garden with as many people as I could. And then during the lockdowns, the infamous lockdowns of 2020, the kitchen garden was in full swing. So if you remember, the first lockdowns happened in March, which is peak abundance, like peak harvest season. So we had, oodles of produce, all this produce that was coming out of the garden. And the garden grows for the on-site restaurant, Heide Kitchen. And so because the restaurant was closed, we had all this produce and nowhere for it to go. So I did a few things. We started sending it off to food relief, which was great, and I learned so much from that in itself. But we also sent messages out to all the Heide staff and said, come and get some produce. Like, we need you to take this. And so staff would collect it, and then they started like sharing around photos on the staff page of the things they'd made with it that night. So they started sharing their plates with all the things they'd made from the produce from the Heide garden. And Maximilian, who is my co-editor on the book, had the genius idea of thinking, well, what would happen if we sent all this produce out to people who really, you know, are experts, who know how to cook, people who are, you know, really creative. Not that the Heide staff aren't amazing cooks, but just, you know, what would happen if we sent it to people who could interpret these beautiful things that we're growing and give us recipes. And anyway, so that's how it was born. And yeah, that's how it came about.
So who are some of your contributors?
Well, we have some amazing contributors, and all of them we chose them in particular because they have a garden to plate kind of mentality. You know, they have that in their own lives and in their own practice. So we asked Annie Smithers, was one of our first. She's been a long time friend of the Heide Gardens. So we were very lucky that Annie agreed to come and do this with us. We have Scott Eddington, who at the time was the chef at the Heide Kitchen, the on-site restaurant. We have Napier Quarter, we have Street, we have Dom and Rose from Florian, Ron and Goran from the Dalesford Longhouse. And we also wanted to include a drinks chapter. So we have Luke Werty from Birdie. He interpreted some of the, you know, he took some of the herbs and some of the beautiful things we grow in the garden and made these amazing cocktails and drinks out of them. And lastly, we have Brianna and Oliver, who at the time were at Hazel Restaurant. So, yes, some really amazing collection of people who produced some, just for me, not being a chef, like just unbelievable recipes.
Yeah, it's really sumptuous and beautiful and celebratory and colourful, and a massive shout out to Robin Lee, who's done the photography. She's just a glorious photographer, and the images really leap from the page. It seems very cookable as well. I guess it's not surprising that a lot of the recipes are vegetable focused. I'd just love you to talk, Alice, about vegetables. Like, what are some of your thoughts and feelings about them?
Okay. Vegetables are, I suppose, you know, they're an easy thing to mostly can be an easy thing to grow. So I suppose the thing that I loved about working in the Heide Garden was just the freedom to choose what I wanted to grow in conjunction with the chefs. So, you know, we'd put things in the ground, and obviously we'd have about a 3 to 4 month harvest period. But just to see something come from nothing, it's actually quite miraculous. And, you know, so in the course of just a few months, whether you're growing, say, broccoli, or even if it's herbs or kale or, you know, tomatoes or cucumbers, whatever you're growing, like, you actually see the act of creation kind of materialize before your eyes. And that for me is like kind of the essence of why gardening is just so, I don't know, again, delightful, I'm going to say, just delightful, because you get to see that everything is connected, and you get to see like that food is really just, you know, it's the earth and it's the sun and those energies working together. And if you can kind of guide them in the right direction, you actually just get this beautiful, abundant, nourishing, you know, it's quite miraculous, you know, day-to-day miracles, I suppose. That's what I love about growing vegetables.
Yeah, I think it is that something out of nothing, and I suppose the chemistry that's in it. I think, you know, you get this sense of all these processes happening around us that we may not pay that much attention to, but they're very important. And it is. I don't know, it's just so rich to be connected to them. And it feels also to me like something of an act of resistance in a world that's very siloed and fast, and makes a lot of demands on us to stop and grow something. What do you think about this idea of gardening as an act of resistance?
Yeah, I wrote about that in the book. In fact, when I When we first came up with the idea for the book and we were kind of putting a pitch together, the very first words I wrote were like, it was food is precious. And I think that often gets lost in the way we live. But when you grow something, when you slow yourself down enough to pay attention to what's going on around you, like you see the essence of what food is. And, you know, we talk about how food is so important and all that sort of thing. It's not just important, it's fundamental. Like we can't survive without it, you know, nothing can exist without food. And to then be able to see that process happening, it brings you back into connection, like into being part of something bigger than yourself. You realize that you know, just like when you look up at the stars and have that kind of, I know I'm getting very esoteric, but when you look up at the stars and you get this sense of, you know, the whole universe is there and you're just one small part of it. Like I get that from growing food because you see the processes, or growing anything really, you see the processes that happen around you. So in a way, like one of the phrases I used in the book was that it can be an antidote to the modern world, like to this disposable world that we live in, where things aren't precious and things are fast and things become less, you know, we pay less attention to what's around us and we become less, we lose that understanding of, you know, being part of something bigger. And gardening, no matter how, you know, even if you just do it a little bit, whether you do it a little bit or a lot, if you pay attention to what you're doing, you can't help but kind of be caught into that. And there's again, I'm coming back to joy, but again, there's a joy in that, in knowing that you are part of something bigger. And when you can grow your own food, you're contributing to kind of more of the world that you want to see more. For me, it's more grounding, more quiet, more things more local, less carbon, less plastic, you know, all of those sorts of things. So that's for me why it's an act of resistance, because the modern world doesn't invite us to do that.
And what about, I mean, food, we can agree that it's practical and necessary, but what about growing things just because they're beautiful?
Oh, yeah, I love that too. Sunday in particular, like she had a practice that she started very early on as a gardener of not just having a veggie garden, but having a veggie garden that was like, I suppose in a way, the French potager garden, like with herbs, with flowers, with just everything kind of growing in all wild abundance together, you know, rather than kind of, I mean, she did have dedicated rows and that sort of thing, but there was a wildness to it. And there was that sense of it being a creative endeavour rather than being just a purely practical thing. And so I've kind of adopted that in my own life and my own garden as well. And I mean, I've got dahlias mixed in with the tomatoes, mixed in with the corn, mixed in with the, you know, and it means that, you know, you have that visual sense of joy. You know, I was talking about that sense of joy in being part of a bigger process. But when you see a flower, like especially a dahlia or a zinnia or a cosmos or a, you know, you kind of can't help but become a bit more open to what's going on around you. It opens you out rather than closing you in. So, yeah, I love growing flowers for that reason, and just that bringing the beauty into the garden.
I'm actually can look at a dahlia right now because I was very fortunate to go to Babington Park, Annie Smithers' farm last week. First to be in the restaurant where the flowers that Susan grows and arranges are so incredible. So when you go to De Fermier, everybody, you are in for a floral treat as well as a culinary treat. But then to go to the farm and see how much time and space is given to the flowers simply because, or profoundly because they are beautiful. I don't know. I found it so instructive. And then to bring a bunch of them back and, you know, they've got ladybirds on them and, you know, every ladybird seemed so precious, and I transferred it carefully to my tiny little garden. I don't know. It's just the gift of beauty. Oh my goodness. Like that. I don't even know the word for it, but I mean, it does make me think, as you said before, of like the stars in the sky and just, chemicals and substances and I don't know, the rotting and worms. And it's like big and little at the same time.
Yeah. The macro in the micro and everything else. And also, everything being part of the same thing, but just the fact that we have the capacity to recognize and, you know, and respond to this beauty. Like we have systems that are able to see it I'm looking at my dahlias in my backyard right now as we speak, but just, you know, it makes your heart a little bit more open. It makes you a bit more, I don't know, it's just a sense of relief for me, that I experience when I see beauty. And then when I'm around people who have devoted time and a little bit of, even a little bit of attention to, cultivating beauty in their own lives, you want more of it.
So, Alice, I'd love you to share a little bit of your story because you haven't always been spilling with the beauty and wonder of existence. You're a lawyer by training and you worked in the law for a long time. Tell us about that and how you made a shift in your life.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So I went to law school and I, got a job dutifully as a lawyer and I worked in litigation for about 10 years. And after about 10 years, I think I was just like depressed and burnt out. So I just thought this is not going to be a great job for me going on for the rest of my life. And so in my mid-30s, I decided to quit what I was doing. And I just stopped for a little bit and I thought, okay, what do I like doing? And I thought, I really like plants. So I studied botany. And that was great. I really enjoyed that. I studied, some Victorian eucalyptus species and did a genetic study of those, and that was fun. But through that process, I learned, I just learned how plants work and I learned how soil works and hello again. And I learned, I just started to understand how plants work. So, eventually that's how I ended up working in the kitchen gardens because a lot of botany can be quite disconnected from actual plants. And I wanted to have a job where I was touching plants and, actually being outside and, having that direct engagement. So, that's how I ended up in the kitchen gardens at Heide. It satisfied something that I think that I really needed to explore. So,
and you're back in the law to some degree now. Like, how are you sort of balancing out your passion for plants and your profession these days?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I'm in a job share, which is, part of the equation, but I'm also working as in-house counsel in an environmental organisation. So I am at least supporting the people who are out there doing the great conservation and revegetation work and, doing all that on-ground work. But I'm working 3 days a week, which means I've got 2 days a week on my own, during the week on my own, and one of those I'm trying very hard to dedicate purely to gardening. So, I think it's a good balance at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, I reckon people listening to this podcast will be inspired by you making those big life changes, but also like wondering how they might tackle it themselves. It can be really terrifying to change direction, especially later in life. We're sort of trained to know what we want to do and then to do it and then to keep doing it. I mean, what sort of advice might you have for people who are feeling like they're not doing what they really want to do, but they're scared to make the big shift?
Yeah, it's really hard, and I don't know if I'm any expert on it because I certainly haven't done it perfectly. It's just been little bits, kind of little iterations along the way that have, kind of shown me what I want to say yes to and what I don't want to say yes to. But I suppose if I were to say anything, it would be just, when you find the things that you love, it, right? There's a very real, kind of very visceral feeling when you're doing something that you really are innately attracted to and that you love. So just do little bits of that as much as you can. If it's gardening, for instance, for me, I just started doing more of it in my spare time. I started learning a little bit about it. I started hanging out with people who knew how to garden. Just, it's just a step-by-step process. And I kind of, before I left the law, I was terrified. And I mean, obviously there's financial consequences that come along with it as well, but it was just, I couldn't have known what the fifth step was until I'd taken the first, second, third and fourth step. So it was like I had to take the first step and then the second step became apparent and then so it's not like I suppose it doesn't have to be an all at once thing. Just little by little by little, get in the places where, the energy is moving and the things are going the way, you're doing the things that you love and you enjoy and sustain you. And, I suppose has to be some confidence and trust that the steps will appear.
I love that. Yeah, I think that's really empowering to think that you don't need to see the end goal to start if you know that you do want to make a change. So I started this podcast by talking about my worm juice. I can probably say I've never started a podcast quite like that before. But let's go back to soil, because I feel like as I'm trying to tend my tiny little patch, that's the part I'm struggling with. Like, why should we care about soil?
The thing I say to people who are just starting out as gardeners or who haven't been gardening for long is, if you spend your time on one thing in the garden, like, let it be the soil. Because I think really about, I'm going to make up some numbers here, but I think like 90% of the success in the garden comes from your soil. So if you've got good soil, you can grow almost anything. And if your soil is not alive and productive and vibrant, then you're always going to have trouble. So really building up good soil is just all of the dead things that have come from the earth going back to the earth and decomposing back into the earth and then nourishing the next generation of plants. So if you can make compost, that's an art in itself, but again, it's just I would suggest to people, just try, just start and try. And then when you have failures, you read and you go back and you work out how you could refine the process. But soil is a living thing. Soil is full of microbes. It's full of, little microscopic creatures and then macroscopic creatures like the worms that are basically creating a living environment that's, perfectly adapted for nourishing plants. So if your soil's living, it's going to hold water. It's going to be a little bit more resistant to dry, hot weather, which we're obviously getting more of now and will continue to get more of. So soil is, in many ways, I think, the key to life, not just to growing food, but if you can, nourish your soil, then your garden will thrive and be much more hardy and tolerant.
So if I've just a bit more about me, I've put my worm juice on and I've watered it in. Is that good? Like, do I dig it through? Do I just wait? Like, can I plant in it straight away? What do I do?
So the first thing is it needs to be diluted. So I'm not sure if you diluted it or not in that process, but you take a little bit because it's super, super concentrated. So if you take a little bit, you can water it down. I mean, I'm, again, making up a number, but say 1 to 5, put it through the soil and then just, let it do its thing. And you probably be on you want to reapply it regularly, but you also want to look at the quality of your soil. Like, I don't want to kind of go into all the detail, but if you pick up some soil in your hand and crunch it together, if it kind of has that nice, it holds together. And, then that'll tell you that it's got all the good things going on inside it. If you pick it up and it just kind of crumbles and it feels really dry, then it's kind of, you look at the consistency of your soil and you're going to see whether the soil's actually going to hold all the goodness that's coming through in your worm juice. Does that make sense?
Yes. I'm going to get off this podcast and go and crunch my soil and check in on it.
We could do a little soil tutorial.
All right. I'll keep that in my back pocket because I might need it down the track. But in the meantime, Alice, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and the story of this beautiful book. I really encourage everybody to look out for it. What are you going to do next time you go in your garden?
I think I'm going to pick a few of my dahlias for my friend. That's a beautiful thing, You've always got so much to give to people. It's just naturally abundant. So, yeah.
I love it, the abundance. Alice, thanks so much for talking to us. It's been really wonderful to have you on Dirty Linen.
Thanks, Dani. It was an absolute pleasure.
This is Dirty Linen, and I'm Dani Valent. We air the issues that the hospitality industry finds hard to talk about, hearing from different people with unique perspectives. We want to hear from you as well. If you have something that needs to be said about a topic, get in touch so we can include your perspective. Contact us at dirtylinen@deepintheweeds.com.au or hit us up on Insta at Dirty Linen Podcast. We can't wait to hear from you.